In the heart of the city, where the sounds of sirens and the rhythm of urban life never cease, a story unfolded that would blur the line between justice and vengeance. It was an ordinary evening, and two police officers were about to make a routine stop, one that would change everything. The man they approached was no ordinary homeless individual. His name was James Hawk Wilson, and though his appearance suggested otherwise, he was once a legend. A man whose name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. A man who had walked among the shadows, a ghost on the battlefield. As the officers moved closer, James stood slowly, his eyes locking onto theirs. There was something in his gaze, something that didn't fit the narrative they had constructed in their minds. He was calm, too calm. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, almost unnerving. "I'm just looking for something to eat," he said. But the officers weren't convinced. They had seen countless homeless individuals before, but this man was different. There was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself, a resilience that belied his circumstances. When James realized they weren't going to let him go, he did something unexpected. He began to recite his military ID number, his voice firm and unwavering. He spoke of his service, his tours, his confirmed kills. He spoke of a life they could hardly imagine, a life of heroism, sacrifice, and unimaginable skill. But instead of pausing, instead of reconsidering their actions, the officers scoffed. They didn't believe him. To them, he was just another homeless man spinning a tall tale to avoid trouble. And so, they treated him worse. They kicked him. They punched him. They dragged him across the rough pavement, as if he were nothing more than garbage. They mocked him, their voices dripping with disdain, their actions fueled by arrogance and ignorance. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the man they were roughing up, the man they were dismissing as a liar, was once the most lethal sniper in U.S. military history. A Green Beret, a ghost, a legend. How'd a man like James Hawk Wilson end up on the streets? What led him from the heights of heroism to the depths of despair? And what happened when the truth about who he really was finally came to light? This is the story of a man forgotten by the world he once protected. A man whose life serves as a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that behind every face lies a story, sometimes more extraordinary than we can imagine. So, what do you think led to this moment? What would you have done if you were in James's shoes? Stay with us as we uncover the truth behind this unforgettable encounter. To understand how James Hawk Wilson became the man he was, the ghost on the battlefield, the legend whispered about in military circles, we must go back to where it all began. Long before the streets, long before the uniform, there was a boy growing up in the rural South, a boy who would one day become one of the most lethal snipers in U.S. military history. James was born in a small, forgotten town where life was hard and opportunities were scarce. His family struggled to make ends meet, and from a young age, James learned the value of resilience. He spent his days exploring the woods, a rifle slung over his shoulder, teaching himself to shoot with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. It wasn't just a hobby for James, it was an escape. The woods were his sanctuary, a place where he could forget about the hardships of his life and focus on the one thing that brought him peace: marksmanship. By the time he was a teenager, James could hit a moving target from hundreds of yards away, a skill that would later define his life. But life in the rural South wasn't easy. Poverty, prejudice, and limited opportunities weighed heavily on James. Yet, instead of breaking him, these challenges forged him into someone stronger, someone determined to rise above his circumstances. When James turned 18, he made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He enlisted in the U.S. Army. For James, it wasn't just a way out. It was a chance to prove himself, to turn his natural talent into something extraordinary. From the moment he stepped in a boot camp, it was clear that James was different. While others struggled with the physical and mental demands of training, James thrived. His marksmanship skills were unparalleled, and his ability to remain calm under pressure set him apart from his peers. It wasn't long before James caught the attention of his superiors. They saw something in him, a rare combination of skill, discipline, and instinct that made him stand out. When the opportunity arose to try out for the Green Berets, the Army's elite Special Forces unit, James didn't hesitate. The selection process was brutal, designed to push candidates to their absolute limits. But James wasn't just any candidate. He was a natural. He moved through the training with a quiet confidence, his focus unwavering, his determination unshakable. By the time he earned his Green Beret, James had already begun to make a name for himself. His fellow soldiers called him Hawk for his sharp eyes and uncanny ability to spot targets others would miss. But it was his skill with a rifle that truly set him apart. James wasn't just a good shot, he was a ghost. He could blend into his surroundings, becoming invisible to the enemy. He could wait for hours, even days, without moving, without making a sound. And when the moment came, he never missed. His first deployment was to a conflict zone where the stakes were high and the margin for error was non-existent. It was there that James's legend began to take shape. On one mission, he was tasked with taking out a high-value target from over a mile away. The conditions were far from ideal: strong winds, low visibility, and a target that was constantly on the move. But James didn't hesitate. He adjusted his scope, calculated the wind speed, and waited. When a shot rang out, it was perfect. The target was eliminated, and James's reputation as one of the best snipers in the military was cemented. From that moment on, James became the go-to sniper for the most dangerous missions. His confirmed kills were numerous, but it was the unconfirmed ones, the missions that were never officially acknowledged, that truly defined his career. James Hawk Wilson wasn't just a soldier. He was a ghost in the battlefield, a legend whose name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. But even legends have a beginning, and for James, that beginning was rooted in the struggles and triumphs of his early life. Stay with us as we delve deeper into the rise of James Hawk Wilson, the man who would become one of the most lethal snipers in history, and the events that would eventually lead him to the streets, where his story would take an unexpected turn. One of his most notable missions took place in a remote, hostile region where intelligence had identified a high-ranking enemy leader. The target was heavily guarded, and the terrain was treacherous. The mission required a sniper who could infiltrate enemy lines, remain undetected, and take the shot with absolute precision. James was the obvious choice. Under the cover of darkness, James moved silently through the rugged landscape, his movements calculated and deliberate. He found his position, a vantage point that gave him a clear line of sight to the target, but left him exposed if discovered. For hours, he lay motionless, his breathing slow and steady, his eyes locked on the target through his scope. When the moment came, James didn't hesitate. The shot was clean, the target eliminated, and James disappeared into the night before the enemy even realized what had happened. Missions like these earned James the nickname Ghost among his peers. He was a phantom, a shadow that moved through the battlefield without leaving a trace. His ability to blend into his surroundings, to become one with the environment, was unmatched. But James's skills weren't just about marksmanship. He had an uncanny ability to read people and situations, to anticipate the enemy's moves before they made them. This intuition, combined with his technical expertise, made him a force to be reckoned with. One particularly harrowing mission involved rescuing a group of hostages held by a militant group. The operation required James to take out several guards without alerting the rest of the compound. Moving silently through the night, James eliminated each guard with precision, creating a path for his team to move in undetected. The mission was a success, and James's role was pivotal. But for James, it wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. It was about the lives he saved, the difference he made. Despite his success, James remained humble. He was a man of few words, preferring to let his actions speak for him. His fellow soldiers respected him not just for his skills, but for his character. He was a leader who led by example, a teammate who could always be relied upon. But even the strongest among us have their limits. After years of service, James began to feel the weight of his experiences. The constant danger, the loss of comrades, the moral complexities of war, It all took a toll. Yet, James continued to push forward, driven by a sense of duty and a commitment to his team. His final mission before returning home was perhaps his most challenging. The target was a notorious warlord who had evaded capture for years. The mission required James to infiltrate a heavily fortified compound, take out the target, and extract without being detected. The operation was a success, but it came at a cost. James was injured during the extraction, a reminder of the risks he faced every time he stepped onto the battlefield. When James returned home, he was hailed as a hero. His service had been exemplary, his contributions immeasurable. But the transition to civilian life was anything but smooth. The man who had once been a ghost on the battlefield now found himself struggling to find his place in a world that felt foreign and unwelcoming. The skills that had made him a legend in the military didn't translate to civilian life. Jobs were scarce, and the memories of war haunted him. James tried to rebuild his life, but the invisible wounds of his service, PTSD, survivor's guilt, and a sense of isolation, were harder to overcome than any physical injury. As the years passed, James found himself drifting further and further from the life he had known. The medals and accolades collected dust, reminders of a past that felt increasingly distant. But even in his darkest moments, James remained resilient. He had faced impossible odds before and come out on top. This was just another battle, one he was determined to win. Little did he know, his greatest challenge was yet to come, a challenge that would test not just his skills, but his very identity. Stay with us as we explore the next chapter in James Hawk Wilson's story, a chapter that would take him from the heights of heroism to the depths of despair, and ultimately to a moment of reckoning that would change everything. After years of service, James Hawk Wilson returned home, not as a ghost, but as a man determined to rebuild his life. The transition to civilian life wasn't easy, but James approached it with the same discipline and determination that had made him a legend on the battlefield. At first, James struggled to adjust. The structured world of the military was gone, replaced by a civilian life that felt chaotic and unfamiliar. But James wasn't one to give up. He sought help for the invisible wounds of war, attending therapy and taking prescribed medication to manage his PTSD. Slowly but surely, he began to find his footing. James found work as a security consultant, a role that allowed him to use his skills in a way that felt meaningful. His reputation as a former Green Beret sniper opened doors, and he quickly became known for his sharp instincts and unwavering professionalism. It was during this time that James met the woman who would change his life. Her name was Clara, a kind-hearted nurse who had a way of seeing the good in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Clara was drawn to James's quiet strength and the depth of his character. She saw past the scars, both visible and invisible, and recognized the man beneath. The hero, the protector, the man who had given so much for his country. For James, Clara was a beacon of light in a world that often felt dark. She brought a sense of peace and stability that he hadn't known since his days in the military. They married within a year, and for the first time in a long time, James felt like he had something to fight for, not on the battlefield, but in his own life. The years that followed were some of the happiest of James's life. He and Clara built a home together, a sanctuary where James could finally let his guard down. He continued to work as a security consultant, but his focus shifted. No longer driven by the need to prove himself, James found fulfillment in the simple joys of life. A quiet evening with Clara, the laughter of friends, the sense of belonging he had always longed for. But life has a way of testing even the strongest among us. One fateful evening, Clara was on her way home from work when her car was struck by a drunk driver. The accident was devastating, and despite the efforts of first responders, Clara didn't survive. For James, the loss was unimaginable. The woman who had been his anchor, his source of strength, was gone. The home they had built together, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt empty and cold. James tried to hold on, to keep moving forward, but the weight of his grief was too much to bear. He stopped taking his medication, convinced that nothing could dull the pain of losing Clara. He withdrew from his work, from his friends, from the world. The man who had once been a ghost on the battlefield now felt like a ghost in his own life. As the months passed, James found himself drifting further and further from the life he had known. The skills that had once made him a legend, his precision, his discipline, his ability to remain calm under pressure, were no match for the overwhelming grief and guilt that consumed him. Eventually, James lost his job. Without Clara, without the structure of work, he began to spiral. The savings he and Clara had built up dwindled, and James found himself unable to keep up with the bills. One by one, the pieces of his life fell away until there was nothing left. James ended up on the streets, a shadow of the man he had once been. The medals and accolades that had once symbolized his achievements now felt like relics of a past he could no longer connect to. But even in his darkest moments, James's resilience never wavered. He survived on the streets the same way he had survived in the battlefield, by relying on his instincts, his training, and his unyielding determination. It was during this time that James's story took an unexpected turn. James Hawk Wilson's life on the streets was a far cry from the disciplined, purposeful existence he had once known. The man who had once commanded respect on the battlefield now found himself invisible to the world he had once protected. But even in the shadows, the ghost of his past lingered. Life on the streets was a daily struggle. James relied on his survival instincts, honed over years of military training, to navigate this harsh new reality. He slept in abandoned buildings, ate whatever he could find, and avoided drawing attention to himself. But no matter how hard he tried to blend in, there was something about James that set him apart. His calm demeanor, his quiet confidence, his ability to remain composed in the face of adversity. These were traits that couldn't be erased, no matter how far he had fallen. But the streets were unforgiving. James faced constant threats from other homeless individuals, from criminals, and even from those who were supposed to protect and serve. It was during one of these encounters that James's story took a dramatic turn. One evening, as James rummaged through a dumpster in search of food, he was approached by two police officers. To them, he was just another homeless man, a nuisance to be dealt with. They didn't see the hero, the legend, the man who had once been the most lethal sniper in U.S. military history. As the officers approached James, their disdain was palpable. They saw him as just another homeless man, a nuisance to be dealt with. But James, ever calm and composed, tried to explain who he was. He recited his military ID number, detailed his service, and even mentioned his time as a Green Beret sniper. The officers didn't believe him. Instead, they mocked him, their laughter cutting through the cold night air. "Yeah, sure, buddy," one of the officers sneered. "And I'm the president." They ordered James to empty his pockets, and when he complied, they found his wallet. Inside was a worn photograph of Clara, his late wife. It was the only picture he had left of her, a cherished memento that he carried everywhere. The officers took the photograph, holding it up to the dim light. "Who's this? Your girlfriend?" One of them jeered. James's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. The other officer smirked. "Looks like she's better off without you." It was a cruel, deliberate act, one that struck at the very core of who James was. The officers didn't stop there. They handcuffed James, their grip unnecessarily rough, and dragged him to their patrol car. As they drove him to the police station, James sat in silence, his mind racing. The man who had once been a ghost on the battlefield, who had faced impossible odds and come out on top, was now being treated as less than human. At the station, James was processed like a common criminal. His protests fell on deaf ears, and his claims of military service were dismissed as the ramblings of a delusional homeless man. But even as he sat in that cold, sterile cell, James's mind was working. The calm, calculating part of him, the part that had made him a legend, was already formulating a plan. James Hawk Wilson had been pushed too far. The man who had once been a hero, a legend, a ghost, was now a man with nothing left to lose. And when a man like James has nothing left to lose, the world had better watch out. The holding cell was small, cold, and dimly lit. James sat on the hard bench, his hands still cuffed, his mind racing. The officers had taken everything from him, his dignity, his freedom, and the last remaining photograph of Clara. The image of her picture dissolving in the puddle replayed in his mind, a sharp reminder of how far he had fallen. But James wasn't broken. Not yet. The officers who had brought him in were now at the front desk, laughing and joking as they filled out paperwork. Their voices carried through the station, loud and careless, as if James were nothing more than an afterthought. One of the officers, the one who had tossed Clara's picture into the water, walked over to the cell. He leaned against the bars, a smirk on his face. "Still think you're some kind of war hero?" he taunted. James didn't respond. He simply stared at the officer, his expression unreadable. The officer's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. There was something about James's calm demeanor, his piercing gaze, that made the officer uncomfortable. But he quickly brushed it off, masking his discomfort with more mockery. "You know what I think?" the officer said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I think you're just another loser who couldn't cut it in the real world. All that talk about being a Green Beret? Pathetic." James remained silent, his hands clenched into fists behind his back. He could feel the weight of the cuffs, the cold metal biting into his skin, but he didn't react. Instead, he focused on the officer's face, memorizing every detail. The officer, unnerved by James's silence, stepped closer to the bars. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Still, James said nothing. Frustrated, the officer turned to his partner. "This guy's a real piece of work. Thinks he's some kind of tough guy." The other officer chuckled, but there was a nervous edge to his laughter. He had been watching James closely, and something about the man in the cell didn't sit right with him. "Maybe we should just leave him here for the night," the second officer suggested. "Let him cool off." The first officer nodded, but as he turned to walk away, James finally spoke. "You took something from me," James said, his voice low and steady. "That picture was all I had left of her. You had no right." The officers froze, surprised by the intensity in James's voice. For a moment, the station fell silent. Then the first officer laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You're still going on about that? It's just a picture, man. Get over it." James's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back against the wall of the cell, his eyes never leaving the officers. The officers exchanged a glance, their unease growing. There was something about James, something dangerous, that they couldn't quite put their finger on, but they didn't have time to dwell on it. The station was busy, and they had other matters to attend to. They left James alone in the cell, their laughter echoing down the hallway as they walked away. James waited until they were gone before he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he began to assess his surroundings. The cell was small, but it wasn't impenetrable. The bars were old, the lock rusted. The officers had taken his wallet, but they hadn't searched him thoroughly. Hidden in the lining of his jacket was a small, makeshift tool, a piece of metal he had salvaged from the streets. It wasn't much, but it was enough. James worked quickly and quietly, his movements precise. Within minutes, he had picked the lock on his cuffs. He rubbed his wrists, the circulation slowly returning, and stood up. The man who had once been a ghost on the battlefield, who had faced impossible odds and come out on top, was now a man with nothing left to lose. And he wasn't going to let this stand. James moved to the cell door, his eyes scanning the station. The officers were distracted, their attention focused on their paperwork. They didn't notice the figure in the shadows, the man who was no longer a prisoner. James Hawk Wilson was free, and he was about to remind the world why they should never have underestimated him. The station was quiet now, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space with an eerie glow. James stood in the shadows of his cell, his eyes locked on the officers at the front desk. They were still laughing, still mocking him, completely unaware of what was about to happen. James moved silently, his training kicking in as he assessed the situation. The cell door was old, the lock rusted and worn. It wouldn't take much to break free, but he had to be careful. One wrong move, and the officers would be on him in seconds. He reached into the lining of his jacket and pulled out the small piece of metal he had hidden there. It was a crude tool, but it was enough. With practiced precision, James worked on the lock, his movements slow and deliberate. The lock clicked open. James pushed the cell door open just enough to slip through, his eyes never leaving the officers. They were still distracted, their backs turned to him. He moved like a shadow, his footsteps silent against the cold concrete floor. Every movement was calculated, every breath controlled. This was what he had been trained for, to move unseen, to strike without warning. As he approached the front desk, one of the officers turned around. For a split second, their eyes met. The officer froze, his face pale with shock. "Hey!" he shouted, fumbling for his radio. "The prisoner's out." But it was too late. James was already moving. He grabbed the officer by the wrist, twisting it until the radio clattered to the floor. With a quick, fluid motion, he disarmed the officer, the gun now in his own hand. The second officer reached for his weapon, but James was faster. He aimed the gun at the officer, his voice calm but firm. "Don't," James said. The officer froze, his hands in the air. James kept the gun trained on the officers as he backed toward the door. His mind was clear, focused. He wasn't here to hurt them, not unless he had to. He just needed to get out. But as he reached the door, something stopped him. On the desk, he saw it, the photograph of Clara. It was wet and crumpled, but it was still intact. James hesitated, his eyes flickering between the photograph and the officers. For a moment, the calm, calculating part of him wavered. Then he made his decision. He grabbed the photograph, tucking it safely into his jacket. The officers watched in stunned silence as he backed out of the station, the gun still in his hand. Once outside, James disappeared into the night, a ghost once more. The officers didn't follow. They were too shaken, too afraid. They had underestimated James Hawk Wilson, and now they were paying the price. But for James, this wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming what had been taken from him, his dignity, his identity, and the memory of the woman he had loved. As he disappeared into the shadows, James knew that this was just the beginning. The world had forgotten him, but he hadn't forgotten the skills that made him a legend. And he wasn't done yet. James Hawk Wilson stood in the shadows of an alleyway, his breath visible in the cold night air. The police station was behind him now, but the events of the evening still burned in his mind. The mocking laughter, the cruel taunts, the photograph of Clara tossed into the water. It was all too much. For years, James had endured the hardships of life on the streets, the weight of his past pressing down on him like a lead blanket. But this was different. This wasn't just another indignity, another blow to his pride. This was a violation, a deliberate act of cruelty that struck at the very core of who he was. And James wasn't going to let it stand. As he walked through the empty streets, his mind began to race. The calm, calculating part of him, the part that had made him a legend, was already formulating a plan. He wasn't just a homeless man anymore. He was a predator, and the officers who had wronged him were now his prey. But James knew he couldn't act impulsively. He needed to be smart, to use the skills that had once made him one of the most lethal snipers in U.S. military history. The first step was gathering resources. James had nothing but the clothes on his back and the small piece of metal he had used to pick the lock on his cuffs. But he was resourceful, a survivor. He knew how to make do with what he had. Over the next few days, James began to rebuild his arsenal. He scavenged for supplies, using his knowledge of the city to find what he needed. A discarded knife here, a length of wire there. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He also began to observe the officers who had humiliated him. He watched them from a distance, noting their routines, their habits, their weaknesses. He learned where they lived, where they worked, where they went when they were off duty. It was during this time that James made a startling discovery. One of the officers, the one who had tossed Clara's photograph into the water, was more than just a cop. He was the son-in-law of the city's mayor. This explained a lot. The officer's arrogance, his sense of impunity, it all made sense now. He wasn't just a bully with a badge. He was a man who believed he was untouchable, protected by his connections and his power. But James knew better. He knew that no one was untouchable, not even the son-in-law of the mayor. As James continued to gather information, he began to piece together a plan. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about sending a message, about showing the world that even the most powerful could be brought down. And James was the man to do it. The man who had once been a ghost on the battlefield, who had faced impossible odds and come out on top, was now a man with nothing left to lose. And he wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Got it. Let me revise part 2 of 3 to reflect that James has already reclaimed Clara's photograph and is now monitoring the officers, witnessing their mistreatment of others, and evading the police manhunt for him. I'll also emphasize his ghost-like movements and the tension of being hunted while he plans his next move. James Hawk Wilson moved through the city like a phantom, his presence undetectable, his movements silent and deliberate. The photograph of Clara was safely tucked into his jacket, a small but significant victory. But James knew this was only the beginning. The officers who had humiliated him were still out there, still wielding their power with arrogance and cruelty. And now, they were looking for him. The police had launched a manhunt, scouring the city for the dangerous homeless man who had escaped custody. Patrol cars roamed the streets, their sirens cutting through the night like a warning. But James was no ordinary fugitive. He was a ghost, a shadow, a man who had spent years mastering the art of invisibility. James avoided the main streets, sticking to alleys, rooftops, and abandoned buildings. He moved with precision, his military training guiding every step. He knew the city better than most, and he used that knowledge to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. But James wasn't just hiding. He was watching. Over the next several days, James observed officers Thompson and Jenkins from a distance, noting their routines, their habits, and their interactions with others. What he saw only deepened his resolve. Thompson and Jenkins weren't just cruel to him. They treated everyone with disdain, especially those who were vulnerable. James watched as they harassed a young black man for jaywalking, their voices loud and aggressive. He saw them rough up an elderly homeless woman, tossing her belongings into the street as she pleaded with them to stop. Each act of cruelty fueled James's anger, but it also sharpened his focus. He wasn't just seeking revenge for himself. He was fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. James's surveillance revealed more than just the officer's cruelty. He learned that Thompson was the son-in-law of the city's mayor, a connection that explained his sense of invincibility. Thompson's badge wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a shield protecting him from the consequences of his actions. Jenkins, on the other hand, was quieter but no less complicit. He followed Thompson's lead, his silence as damning as his partner's cruelty. James noted that Jenkins often lingered behind after their shifts, stopping at a diner near the station. It was a small detail, but one that James filed away for later. As James continued to monitor the officers, he also kept an eye on the manhunt. The police were growing increasingly frustrated, their search turning desperate. They combed through homeless encampments, interrogated street vendors, and even set up checkpoints around the city. But James was always one step ahead. He avoided the encampments, knowing they would be the first place the police would look. Instead, he stayed on the move, blending into the background like the ghost he had once been on the battlefield. One night, as James watched from the rooftop of an abandoned building, he saw something that made his blood boil. Thompson and Jenkins had pulled over a black teenager for a broken taillight. The boy was nervous, his hands trembling as he handed over his license. Thompson smirked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You know how many tickets I could write you for, kid? Broken taillight, expired registration, and I'm pretty sure that smell is marijuana." The boy protested, his voice shaking. "I don't have anything, I swear." But Thompson wasn't listening. He dragged the boy out of the car, slamming him against the hood as Jenkins stood by, his arms crossed. James's grip tightened on the edge of the rooftop, his knuckles white. He wanted to intervene, to step in and stop the injustice. But he knew he couldn't, not yet. Instead, he watched as Thompson handcuffed the boy and shoved him into the back of the patrol car. The boy's face was a mask of fear and humiliation, a look James knew all too well. As the patrol car drove away, James made a silent promise. He would make Thompson and Jenkins pay, not just for what they had done to him, but for what they were doing to others. Over the next few days, James began to gather the tools he would need for his plan. He scavenged for supplies, using his knowledge of the city to find what he needed. A discarded hunting knife, a roll of duct tape, a small flashlight. Each item was carefully selected and tested. He also began to map out his strategy. Thompson's connection to the mayor made him a dangerous target, but James wasn't deterred. He knew that taking down Thompson would send a message that no one was untouchable. James's first move was subtle but effective. He began to disrupt Thompson's routine in small, almost imperceptible ways. He slashed the tires on Thompson's patrol car, forcing him to take a different vehicle. He tampered with Thompson's radio, causing it to malfunction during a routine call. Each act was designed to unsettle Thompson, to make him question his own invincibility. And it worked. Thompson grew increasingly paranoid, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. But James wasn't done. Over the next few days, James continued to disrupt Thompson's life, each act more daring than the last. He broke into Thompson's house, leaving behind a note that read, "You're not untouchable." He hacked into Thompson's computer, exposing his gambling debts to his superiors. Each act was designed to chip away at Thompson's confidence, to make him question his own power. And it worked. Thompson grew increasingly paranoid, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. But James wasn't just targeting Thompson. He was also gathering evidence that would expose the corruption and arrogance that had allowed Thompson and Jenkins to treat him, and others like him, with such disdain. James knew that his plan was risky, that it could cost him everything. But he didn't care. He had nothing left to lose, and he wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The hunt for James Hawk Wilson was not splashed across the news, nor were there helicopters circling the skies. The police were looking for him, but quietly, discreetly. They couldn't afford a public scandal, not with Thompson's connection to the mayor. The last thing they wanted was attention drawn to the fact that a homeless man, a decorated Green Beret sniper, had outsmarted them and escaped custody. But James knew they were searching. He could feel it in the increased patrols, in the way officers lingered in areas where the homeless congregated, in the subtle tension that hung in the air. He stayed on the move, blending into the shadows, his every step calculated. He was a ghost, and the city was his battlefield once more. James wasn't just hiding, though. He was gathering evidence, piecing together a case against Thompson and Jenkins that would expose their corruption and cruelty. He watched them closely, documenting their actions, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the streets were bathed in the golden glow of twilight. James was perched on a fire escape, his eyes scanning the street below, when he saw them. Thompson and Jenkins, their patrol car idling near a dimly lit alley. A black woman, no older than 30, was walking down the sidewalk, her arms laden with grocery bags. She was minding her own business, her pace brisk but unhurried. Thompson stepped out of the car, his posture aggressive, and called out to her, "Hey you, stop right there." The woman froze, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Me? What's wrong?" Thompson approached her, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "We got a report of someone matching your description, stealing from a store nearby. We need to search your bags." The woman's voice trembled. "I didn't steal anything. I just bought these groceries. See." She held up a receipt, her hands shaking. Jenkins stepped in, his tone mocking. "Yeah, sure. Let's see what you've got in there." They began rifling through her bags, tossing items onto the sidewalk. A loaf of bread, a carton of milk, a bag of apples. The woman protested, her voice rising in desperation, but the officers ignored her. James's jaw tightened as he watched from above. He had seen enough. He descended the fire escape with the grace of a predator, his movements silent and deliberate. By the time he reached the street, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. James stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "What's going on here?" Thompson turned, his eyes narrowing as he recognized James. "You." But James didn't give him a chance to finish. He addressed the crowd, his voice loud and clear. These officers are harassing an innocent woman. They have no proof, no reason to treat her this way. Is this how they protect and serve? The crowd murmured, their unease growing. Someone pulled out a phone and began recording. Thompson's face turned red with anger. "Shut your mouth, or I'll arrest you right here." James didn't flinch. "Go ahead, arrest me, but the whole world will see what kind of officers you really are." Jenkins stepped forward, his hand on his baton. "You're under arrest." But James was already moving. He slipped into the crowd, his movements fluid and precise. The officers tried to follow, but the crowd had grown larger, their voices rising in protest. "Leave him alone," someone shouted. "What did she do wrong?" another demanded. James disappeared into the sea of people, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket. By the time Thompson and Jenkins pushed their way through the crowd, he was gone. The officers stood there, their faces flushed with anger and humiliation. The crowd continued to shout, their phones capturing every moment. James watched from a distance, his heart pounding with adrenaline. He had made his point, but he knew this wasn't over. Thompson and Jenkins would come after him with everything they had. But James was ready. He had been a ghost on the battlefield, and he was a ghost now. The city was his domain, and he would use every skill he had to bring the officers to justice. As he melted into the night, James knew one thing for certain. The world was about to see the truth. And when it did, Thompson and Jenkins would no longer be untouchable. James Hawk Wilson had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He had watched, waited, and planned, gathering every piece of information he could about officers Thompson and Jenkins. He knew their routines, their weaknesses, and their arrogance. And now it was time to act. The first step was to lure the officers into a situation where they were vulnerable. James knew that Thompson and Jenkins were growing increasingly paranoid, their confidence shaken by the public confrontation and the growing scrutiny of their actions. They were on edge, and James intended to use that to his advantage. He began by planting subtle clues, leading the officers to believe they were closing in on him. He left traces of his presence in areas they frequented, a discarded hoodie near the bar they visited after their shifts, a note scrawled with his military ID number in an alley they patrolled. Each clue was designed to draw them in, to make them believe they were finally gaining the upper hand. But James wasn't just leading them into a trap. He was also setting the stage for their humiliation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city streets were bathed in the glow of streetlights, James made his move. He positioned himself in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place he had scouted days earlier. The warehouse was isolated, its windows broken, its walls covered in graffiti. It was the perfect location for what he had planned. James waited in the shadows, his breathing slow and steady, his senses heightened. He didn't have to wait long. Thompson and Jenkins arrived in their patrol car, their movements tense and cautious. They had received an anonymous tip about James's whereabouts, and they were determined to bring him in. As they stepped out of the car, their weapons drawn, James watched from above. He was perched on a catwalk, his silhouette barely visible against the dim light. "You sure he's in here?" Jenkins asked, his voice low and nervous. "He's here," Thompson replied, his tone confident but edged with tension. "I can feel it." They moved through the warehouse, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. James waited until they were directly below him before he made his presence known. "Looking for me?" The officers spun around, their weapons raised, but James was already moving. He dropped from the catwalk, landing silently behind them. Before they could react, he disarmed Jenkins with a swift, precise motion, sending the officer's gun skittering across the floor. Thompson turned, his weapon trained on James, but James was faster. He knocked the gun from Thompson's hand with a sharp strike, sending it clattering to the ground. The officers stared at him, their faces pale with shock. "You think you can just harass people, abuse your power, and get away with it?" James said, his voice calm but filled with intensity. "You think you're untouchable?" Thompson lunged at him, his fists swinging, but James sidestepped the attack with ease. He countered with a series of precise strikes, each one designed to incapacitate without causing permanent harm. Jenkins tried to intervene, but James was ready. He disarmed the officer with a quick, fluid motion, sending him sprawling to the ground. Within moments, both officers were on their knees, their hands raised in surrender. James stood over them, his breathing steady, his eyes cold. "You're not untouchable," he said, "and you're not invincible." With that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving the officers humiliated and terrified. But James wasn't done. This was just the beginning. Over the next few days, James continued to disrupt Thompson and Jenkins's lives, each act more daring than the last. He leaked evidence of their misconduct to the media, exposing their corruption and cruelty to the world. The public outcry was immediate. Protests erupted across the city, with citizens demanding accountability and justice. The police department was forced to launch an internal investigation, and Thompson and Jenkins were suspended pending the outcome. But James knew that wasn't enough. He needed to ensure that the officers would never abuse their power again. One night, as Thompson left his house, he found a note taped to his door. It read, "You're not alone." Thompson's hands trembled as he read the words, his confidence shattered. He knew that James was out there, watching, waiting, and he knew that he would never be safe again. James Hawk Wilson had always known that Thompson and Jenkins were just the tip of the iceberg. Their arrogance, their cruelty, their abuse of power, it was all enabled by a system that protected them. And at the top of that system was the head of the police department, Chief Harold Grayson. Grayson had always been a staunch defender of Thompson and Jenkins, dismissing complaints about their behavior as exaggerated or misunderstood. He had turned a blind eye to their misconduct, shielding them from consequences and allowing their corruption to fester. James knew that if he wanted to truly dismantle the system, he would have to go after Grayson. But first, he had to deal with the immediate threat. The police were closing in. After the incident at the warehouse, Thompson and Jenkins had reported the encounter, and Grayson had authorized a full-scale manhunt. 5 officers, handpicked for their loyalty to the department, were tasked with bringing James in by any means necessary. James had anticipated this. He knew the officers would come for him, and he was ready. The first attack came late one night, as James was moving through a quiet residential neighborhood. He had just turned a corner when he saw them. 5 officers, their weapons drawn, their faces grim. "Freeze," one of them shouted. "You're under arrest." James didn't hesitate. He moved with the precision and speed of a man who had spent years on the battlefield, his every action calculated and deliberate. The officers opened fire, but James was already in motion. He dodged the bullets with ease, his movements fluid and precise. He disarmed the first officer with a swift strike, sending the man's gun skittering across the pavement. The second officer lunged at him, but James sidestepped the attack, countering with a series of precise strikes that left the man crumpled on the ground. The third and fourth officers tried to flank him, but James was ready. He used the environment to his advantage, ducking behind a parked car and using it as cover. When the officers moved in, he disarmed them with a quick, fluid motion, sending their weapons clattering to the ground. The fifth officer hesitated, his hands trembling as he raised his weapon. James stared him down, his eyes cold and unyielding. "You don't have to do this," James said, his voice calm but filled with intensity. "You don't have to be part of this corruption." The officer lowered his weapon, his face pale with fear. James didn't wait for him to change his mind. He disappeared into the night, leaving the officers humiliated and defeated. But James knew this wasn't over. The attacks would continue, and he couldn't keep fighting them off forever. He needed to strike at the heart of the problem, and that meant going after Chief Grayson. James spent the next few days gathering information about Grayson, learning everything he could about the man who had enabled Thompson and Jenkins's corruption. He discovered that Grayson had a pattern of protecting officers who crossed the line, using his influence to bury complaints and silence whistleblowers. But James also found something else, something that could bring Grayson down. Grayson had a secret, one that he had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. He had been embezzling funds from the department, using the money to finance a lavish lifestyle. It was a bombshell revelation, one that could destroy Grayson's career and reputation. James knew what he had to do. One night, as Grayson left the police station, He found a note tucked under his windshield wiper. It read, "You're not untouchable." Grayson's hands trembled as he read the words. His confidence shattered. He knew that James was out there, watching, waiting, and he knew that he would never be safe again. Chief Harold Grayson sat in his office, the note clutched in his trembling hands. The words, "You're not untouchable," burned into his mind, a constant reminder of the threat looming over him. He had spent years building his empire, shielding his officers from consequences, and protecting his own secrets. But now, James Hawk Wilson had exposed the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Grayson knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let James destroy everything he had worked for. But James was no ordinary adversary. He was a ghost, a man who had spent years mastering the art of invisibility and precision. Grayson had underestimated him once, and he wouldn't make that mistake again. Meanwhile, James was already moving. He had spent days gathering evidence against Grayson, compiling a dossier of corruption, embezzlement, and abuse of power. He knew that exposing Grayson publicly would be the final blow, the reckoning that would bring the entire system crashing down. But James also knew that Grayson wouldn't go down without a fight. One evening, as Grayson left the police station, he was met by a crowd of protesters. They had gathered outside the building, their voices rising in anger as they demanded accountability and justice. Grayson tried to push through the crowd, his face flushed with frustration, but the protesters wouldn't let him pass. "We know what you've done," someone shouted. "You can't hide anymore," another cried. Grayson's heart raced as he realized what was happening. James had leaked the evidence to the media, and now the whole world knew the truth. As Grayson struggled to make his way to his car, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned, his eyes widening as he came face to face with James. "You?" Grayson stammered, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" James's eyes were cold, his expression unreadable. "I want justice," he said. "For everyone you've hurt, everyone you've silenced. It's over, Grayson." Grayson tried to pull away, but James's grip was firm. "You think you could just walk away from this?" Grayson hissed. "You're nothing but a homeless man. No one will believe you." James leaned in, his voice low and steady. "They already do." With that, he released Grayson and disappeared into the crowd, leaving the chief standing there, his confidence shattered. The fallout was immediate. The media descended on the police department, demanding answers. The public outcry was deafening, with citizens calling for Grayson's resignation and a full investigation into the department's corruption. Grayson tried to fight back, using his influence to discredit the evidence and silence his critics. But it was no use. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back in the box. Within days, Grayson was forced to resign. Thompson and Jenkins were arrested, their careers in ruins. The department was thrown into chaos, with internal investigations and reforms sweeping through its ranks. And through it all, James remained a ghost, his presence felt but never seen. He didn't seek recognition or praise. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted justice. In the end, James didn't need a weapon to exact his revenge. All he needed was his mind, his training, and the knowledge that he was still the ghost they never saw coming. The reckoning had come, and the system would never be the same. The city was in chaos. The revelations about Chief Grayson, Thompson, Jenkins, and the systemic corruption within the police department had sent shockwaves through every corner of society. Protests erupted daily, with citizens demanding accountability, transparency, and justice. The media was relentless, dissecting every detail of the scandal, while politicians scrambled to distance themselves from the fallout. But amidst the uproar, one question lingered in the minds of the public. Who was James Hawk Wilson? Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed he was a vigilante, a shadowy figure who had taken justice into his own hands. Others believed he was a myth, a symbol of resistance conjured by the collective anger of the oppressed. A few even whispered that he was a ghost, a man who had returned from the dead to right the wrongs of the living. The truth, however, remained elusive. James had vanished, disappearing back into the shadows as quickly as he had emerged. No one knew where he was, or if he was even still alive. But his presence was felt everywhere, a silent force that continued to shape the city's destiny. For James, the aftermath was a time of reflection. He had achieved what he set out to do, exposing the corruption, humiliating those who had abused their power, and forcing the system to confront its flaws. But the cost had been high. He had lost everything: his home, his identity, the life he had once known. And yet, in some ways, he had gained something far more valuable: a sense of purpose. James moved through the city like a ghost, his presence undetectable, his movements silent and deliberate. He avoided the main streets, sticking to alleys, rooftops, and abandoned buildings. He knew the city better than most, and he used that knowledge to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. But James wasn't just hiding. He was watching. He observed the changes taking place in the city, the reforms being implemented, the officers being held accountable. He saw the protests, the rallies, the growing demand for justice. And he knew that his actions had sparked something powerful, a movement that would continue long after he was gone. Yet, James also knew that the fight was far from over. The system was deeply entrenched, and there were still those who sought to protect it. Chief Grayson may have fallen, but there were others like him, men and women who would stop at nothing to maintain their power. James had no illusions about the dangers he faced. The police were still looking for him, their manhunt growing more desperate by the day. But James wasn't afraid. He had faced impossible odds before, and he had always come out on top. One night, as James watched from the rooftop of an abandoned building, he saw something that made his blood boil. A group of officers, their faces obscured by masks, were harassing a young black man on the street below. James recognized one of the officers, a man named Harass, who had been a close ally of Grayson. Harass had been one of the officers tasked with bringing James in, and he had a reputation for brutality. James didn't hesitate. He descended the fire escape with the grace of a predator, his movements silent and precise. By the time he reached the street, the officers had already handcuffed the young man and were dragging him toward their patrol car. James stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Let him go." The officers turned, their eyes widening as they recognized James. Harass smirked, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Well, look who decided to show up. You're a hard man to find, Wilson." James didn't respond. He simply stared at Harass, his expression unreadable. Harris's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing but a criminal." James took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "I'm not the one abusing my power." Harass drew his weapon, his hands trembling slightly. "Stay back, or I'll shoot." James didn't flinch. "Go ahead, but the whole world will see what kind of officer you really are." Before Harass could react, James disarmed him with a swift, precise motion, sending the gun skittering across the pavement. The other officers tried to intervene, but James was faster. He incapacitated them with a series of precise strikes, leaving them crumpled on the ground. The young man stared at James, his eyes wide with awe. "Who are you?" James didn't answer. He simply unlocked the man's handcuffs and handed him the key. "Go home," he said, "and stay safe." With that, James disappeared into the night, leaving the officers humiliated and defeated. But James knew this wasn't over. The attacks would continue, and he couldn't keep fighting them off forever. He needed to strike at the heart of the problem, and that meant going after the system itself. James spent the next few weeks gathering evidence, compiling a dossier of corruption that reached far beyond the police department. He exposed politicians, business leaders, and other powerful figures who had enabled the abuse of power. The revelations sent shockwaves through the city, sparking a wave of resignations, arrests, and reforms. The public rallied behind James, their anger and frustration boiling over into a movement for change. But through it all, James remained a ghost, his presence felt but never seen. He didn't seek recognition or praise. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted justice. In the end, James Hawk Wilson had proven one thing. You can push a hero too far, but you can never break him. The city would never be the same, and neither would James. But as he disappeared into the shadows once more, he knew that his work was far from over. The fight for justice would continue, and James would be there, watching, waiting, and ready to strike. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or a knife. It's the truth. And James Hawk Wilson was the ghost who delivered it. James Hawk Wilson's story is one of resilience, justice, and the unbreakable spirit of a man who refused to be forgotten. It is a story that challenges us to look beyond appearances, to question the systems that govern our lives, and to recognize the humanity in those society often overlooks. From his early days as a small-town marksman to his rise as one of the most lethal snipers in U.S. military history, James was a man defined by his discipline, his skill, and his unwavering sense of duty. But his journey didn't end on the battlefield. It continued in the streets of a city that had forgotten him, in the shadows where he fought not just for himself, but for those who couldn't fight for themselves. James's fall from grace was not a failure of character, but a failure of the system. A system that praised him as a hero, but abandoned him when he needed help the most. A system that allowed corruption to flourish and power to be abused. A system that treated him as less than human, even as he fought to protect it. But James refused to be broken. He refused to be forgotten. When he was pushed too far, when the injustices became too much to bear, James did what he had always done. He fought back, not with weapons or violence, but with truth, with strategy, with the unyielding determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. His actions sparked a movement, a reckoning that forced the city to confront its flaws and demand change. But James's story is not just about vengeance. It's about resilience. It's about the power of one man to make a difference, even when the odds are stacked against him. It's about the importance of empathy, of seeing the humanity in others, and of never underestimating the strength of those who have been pushed to the edge. James's journey reminds us that heroes come in many forms. They're not always the ones wearing capes or medals. Sometimes they're the ones society has cast aside, the ones who fight not for glory, but for justice. As we reflect on James's story, we are reminded of the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what is right, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to be forgotten. So, what do you think about James's actions? Was his revenge justified? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we see the world. In the end, James Hawk Wilson's story is not just about vengeance. It's about resilience, justice, and the unbreakable spirit of a man who refused to be forgotten. And it's a story that will continue to inspire, to challenge, and to remind us that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope.